Welcome back. Can I just update people on the arrangements for next week? Richard Tedder, who was due to give his evidence on Monday and Tuesday, will not now be giving his evidence on either day. Monday you already know about. He will not be giving evidence on Tuesday. His evidence is likely to be rescheduled for the, I think, third week of October. But you will have confirmation of that later. Thank you very much. Ms. Richards.
Lord Crisp, I want to pick up then your interactions with Lord Jenkin and look at the relevant documentation in relation to that. Lord Jenkin, as Patrick Jenkin MP, had been Secretary of State for Health and Social Services between May 1979 and September 1981. He was the predecessor to Norman Fowler as Secretary of State in Mrs Thatcher's government. Now, if we just look first of all at what you say in your first statement about your recollection of these events, WITN 3996001, page 8, please, Lawrence. You say this at paragraphs 36 and 37. On receiving this request, that was the request from the inquiry for a statement, I had some but only limited recollection of dealing with Lord Jenkin on this issue. My memory is of a telephone call from Lord Jenkin in which he essentially told me that records from his time in office had been destroyed and asked for a meeting. I do not have any memory of the meeting with Lord Jenkin on the 13th of April 2005, although from the records, see below, I entirely accept that I did meet with him on that occasion. I have a further recollection of him saying something to me in passing in the House of Lords, which I think was about him speaking in a debate on the subject in the House in 2009. Electronic records available to the current DHSC have been searched to try and identify relevant records in relation to this issue. Save for my very limited memory as set out above, I'm dependent on these records. And because of your limited recollection, Lord Chris, we'll go through the records chronologically that we do have. But does this remain the position in terms of what you can independently remember?
Oh, entirely. Actually, my memory is of a telephone call from Lord Jenkin. I don't know if that happened. I think that was probably the telephone call he made to my private secretary. So, but that seemed to have stuck in my mind. So I think it was a mistaken memory.
We can take that down, thank you. So if we pick things up with a letter that Lord Jenkin wrote to Lord Warner in December 2004, WITN 3996004, we can see date of the letter 14th of December 2004. It's from Lord Jenkin to Norman Warner. And he says, I enclose a letter I've had from a Mr., and I'm just going to say Mr. X for current purposes, the name is obviously redacted, who raises a number of subjects, including a so-called secret Westminster-funded report into haemophilia and hepatitis non-A, non-B between 1979 and 82, for most of which time I was the Secretary of State for Health and Social Services. I also enclose a copy of my reply to Mr. X, which makes it clear that because I was the minister at the time he's inquiring about, I feel under some duty to try and satisfy his curiosity. You will also see that I've no present recollection of any secret report into the subject, but it may be that the files could disclose something along those lines. I would be most grateful if you could consult officials and let me know whether there's any point in my taking this matter further. It's clear from Mr. X's letter that he's been in touch with other parliamentarians, but as I was the Secretary of State at the time, perhaps I have a special obligation to try to help him. I would, of course, be very happy to attend a meeting at the Departmental. This would be one way of taking the matter forward. Now, this, as I understand it, is the letter which triggered the sequence of events which led to you having a meeting and having correspondence with Lord Jenkin. We see reference in the handwriting in the bottom corner of the page to Zubida Sidat, policy lead on this one, and we'll see her name appear on a number of the documents, and indeed she's giving evidence to the inquiry this week. If we just go over the page...
May I just make one comment on that? I'm encouraged to see, in the light of what we were just saying about records, that Lord Warner's personal note at the top is included, isn't it? Advice on this, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we just go over the page, and if we just put briefly this and the page 3 side by side, Lawrence. I'm not proposing to go through these, but we have on the right Mr. X's letter to Lord Jenkin, 4th of December, and then on the left of the screen we have Lord Jenkin's reply to Mr. X. And it's that correspondence referred to in Lord Jenkin's letter to Lord Warner, which essentially triggers the events we're going to explore. Now, I don't think, if we just go back to the first page, please, Lawrence. I don't think we can tell from this document whether it came across your desk at this point in time. It did come across your desk later, as we'll pick up. If we then go to Lord Warner's reply to Lord Jenkin, WITN 3996005, this is dated the 27th of January 2005. Dear Patrick, thank you for your letter of the 14th of December enclosing correspondence from Mr. X about past papers relating to haemophilia. I apologise for the delay in replying to you. Then the next paragraph explains his understanding of Lord Jenkins' wish to be helpful. Difficult to go back some 25 years to recollect details. The third paragraph says, my officials have carried out a search of the relevant files but can find no trace of information relating to the secret Westminster funded report that Mr. X mentions. And then the next paragraph then refers to a report traced by the Scottish executive of the Haemophilia Centre Directors Hepatitis Working Party, and that's provided to Lord Jenkin. And then we have a series of paragraphs which this inquiry knows from other letters are fairly standard paragraphs for inclusion in correspondence at around this time. So the penultimate paragraph on the page refers to great sympathy for those who've become ill or who've lost loved ones, understanding of hardship and distress. And then the bottom paragraph deals with not accepting liability. The government does not accept any wrongful practices were employed, doesn't consider a public inquiry justified. Donor screening was introduced in 1991. The development of this test marked a major advance in microbiological technology which could not have been implemented before this time. And then over the page refers to decision-making as regards the making of ex gratia payments. You, I think, didn't have any input into the drafting of this letter.
No. I'm sure I didn't, but yeah.
It might be said, and we'll pick up how the department viewed this letter shortly, but it might be said that this was a letter focusing on defending the government's position rather than fully responding to the request for information. Would you have any comment on that?
If you go back to the page before, doesn't he produce this document which is the secret, which we assume is the secret report?
Yes.
Which I would have thought was quite helpful.
May or may not be. Yes, he produces that report, but then sets out a number of matters which aren't really the matters Lord Jenkin had inquired about.
That, I think, is certainly true, and certainly those seem to be the sort of standard lines to take, yeah? Yes.
In any event, it appears that Lord Jenkin was not particularly, or had some concerns about the letter, and we can see that from WITN 3996006. It's a series of emails, and if we start on page 3, the bottom of the page, we can see there's an email from Sean Gallagher, 9th of February 2005, to Zabida Sidat and others. Now, Sean Gallagher was who?
He was the head of my private office. He was the person who had the phone call that I thought I had.
So we can see he says this, Zabida, we discussed this case. As Francis knows, I had a phone call from Lord Jenkin in response to the letter he received from Lord Warner. He was concerned that the reply he had received gave the impression that the department held no records on the subject in question and was, over the page, looking to take up the issue of DH's filing and document management with the permanent secretary. Although I've looked at the original letter and the reply sent, attached below, I do not really understand what the situation is. For instance, whether the Scottish papers are likely to be the secret Westminster-funded report that Mr X was talking about, whether our records of anything on the subject of the Haemophilia Centre Director's Hepatitis Working Party at all, and why the Scottish Executive have records that we don't. This presumably was either an English or UK initiative. You thought that a rather fuller reply could have been given to the letter and offered to do a follow-up letter. I think that this should most sensibly come from Lord Warner, again, if Francis does not object. And then there's a request for a draft, and then a suggestion that Mr Gallagher would phone Lord Jenkins to tell him to expect a further letter on the subject. So that's the first email in this chain. If we go back to page 3, please, Lawrence. We can see there's then an exchange of emails about the timing of the sending of the letter, because Lord Warner was going to be out of the country. We don't need to look at those. If we go to the second page, we just pick it up at the bottom of the page. We have an email from Francis Smethurst, who's the private secretary to PSL. So that would be, I think, to Lord Warner as Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the Lords. And then she says in the first paragraph of the email that she thinks it's right that the letter should probably come from Lord Warner. And then she asks Zubeda Sidat to attach to a draft letter a short background note covering the points that Mr Gallagher had made. And then if we go to page 1, we see at the bottom of the page Ms Sidat sending an email 1st of March 2005. As agreed, I've drafted a background note and letter to Lord Jenkins, and it was agreed that that would be cleared by the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Public Health, PSPH, and we can see from the top line on the screen that the PSPH was happy with the letter. So do you have any recollection now of whether Mr Gallagher discussed the phone call he'd received from Lord Jenkins with you?
Oh, I'm sure he must have done, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why I assume that it was actually a phone call with me. But I think he would have told me that he had a phone call, and indeed, I think I cover this in my statement, don't I, that he told me that he wanted to see me about records.
Yes, and we'll pick that up. We'll go through it stage by stage chronologically. If we then go to WITN 3996007, this is the background note, or it's headed background note, that was produced whether by Ms Sidat or someone else within the blood policy team. It refers to Lord Jenkins having written to Lord Warner about the letter and so on. And then paragraph 3 says this: unfortunately, in this case, the reply from Lord Warner to Lord Jenkins was drafted by the correspondence unit using a number of standard lines, and the reply did not fully address the points raised in the letter. It also left Lord Jenkins with the impression that we had inadequate file records. Lord Jenkins rang Sir Nigel's office to take up the issue of the department's filing and document management system. The draft letter seeks to reassure Lord Jenkins that DH does operate an effective records management system. We've also used this opportunity to give Lord Jenkins a fuller response to his letter. So that's the background note, which, as we'll see, I think was perhaps inadvertently sent to Lord Jenkins, not Jenkins,
Lord Jenkins,
along with
not
the
Jenkins,
letter.
indeed.
But the letter that was drafted as a further letter for Lord Warner to send to Lord Jenkins, we have at WITN 3996008. I think we've got it in this draft form, I think, rather than the final as sent form, but may have been no difference. So we can see, if we just go to the second page, we can see it's from Lord Warner.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we go back to the first page, first paragraph reads, I've been advised that you recently contacted Sir Nigel's office about my letter. I understand you expressed concern about the department's filing and record management systems. I would firstly like to correct the impression I may have given that we hold no records on the treatment of haemophilia patients' blood safety and related issues. The Department of Health has a departmental records office that holds closed files on these areas. These files have been subject to a branch review. Clearly, keeping good records is fundamental to the day-to-day running of the department. We recognise that much of the work we do has long-term consequences, and accurate records are essential if future users are to be able to see why certain decisions were made or why certain things did or did not happen. This is a message that's regularly communicated and reinforced to staff. And then Mr. X refers to what he calls a secret Westminster report. Officials have established that this refers to the document entitled Haemophilia Centre Directors Hepatitis Working Party Report from 1980 to 81. A copy was attached to the letter I sent you. The paper indicates the existence of non-A, non-B hepatitis, and that in the 70s, treatment with blood clotting factor concentrates carried a risk of infection with non-A, non-B hepatitis. Unfortunately, in the 70s and early 80s, before effective viral inactivation procedures had been developed, many patients with haemophilia were inadvertently infected with hepatitis C from contaminated blood products. The prevailing opinion among clinicians at the time was that non-A, non-B hepatitis caused a mild and often asymptomatic illness. The more serious consequences of hepatitis C, which may take 20 to 30 years to develop, only became apparent after full characterisation of the virus in 1989 and the development of tests for its recognition. There's a handful of points here, Lord Crisp, I may want to come back to, but at the moment I just want to deal with the chronology. The paper does not show that anyone acted wrongly in the light of the facts and measures that were available to them at the time. I believe that Mr. X has been campaigning for a public inquiry. However, as previously stated, the government does not accept that any wrongful practices were employed at the time, does not consider that a public inquiry can be justified. There's then a suggestion about contacting the National Blood Authority or the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation for copies of minutes. And then there's a reference in the bottom of the page to files on the Advisory Committee of the National Blood Transfusion Service. And if we go over the page, there's a suggestion that Mr. X should contact Mr. Conan, William Conan, the Department of Health official, I think then leading the blood policy team, if he wanted to pursue inquiries relating to those documents. So that's at the very least the draft, the further draft of the letter for Lord Warner to send back to Lord Jenkin. Again, I think at this point in time, I don't think there's any documentation to suggest that these drafts were seen by you.
No, I wouldn't expect so.
If we then please go to WITN 3996009. Again, this is a series of emails, and if we pick it up at the bottom of the second page, which is the email first in time, we can see it's an email to Sean, so Sean Gallagher in your private office, 16th of March 2005. I've just taken a call from Lord Jenkin. He says he's spoken / been in correspondence, question mark, with you about some letters from Lord Warner on 10th of March and 27th of Jan relating to some hepatitis issues and his needs to access papers when he was Secretary of State from 1979 to 1981. And he's now requested a meeting with Nigel. So that's clearly a direct communication from Lord Jenkin to the department, coming to your office, asking for a meeting with you. Mm-hmm. If we go further up the page, the next email is from Sean Gallagher to Francis Smethurst, 16th of March. You haven't heard anything from Lord J in response to the most recent letter, have you? If he really wants a meeting, I imagine we'll have to agree, ... That might be said to suggest a degree of reluctance on the part of your private office to agree to a meeting?
Only in as much as you can imagine the volume of correspondence that people get and the pressure on people's diaries, and the more that you can deal with correspondence rather than face-to-face, the much more efficient it is. So I think, whilst I can see why you say that, I think that isn't anything particularly related to this particular letter. I think it's much more that my office would try and get things dealt with by correspondence rather than trying to secure space in my diary, frankly.
And then the top of the page is a response back from Francis Smethurst to Sean Gallagher saying this. He hasn't spoken to us, but he did speak to Lord Warner the other day. Mm-hmm. He says that his issue is not with Lord Warner and thanked him for the recent letter, which he found helpful. However, he believes that he's being denied access to papers which relate to, I think, his time as Secretary of State, which I believe was from 1979 to 1981.
Yeah.
He argues that, under the Ministerial Code, he's entitled to review papers from his time in office, assuming that is that they are still available. I suspect that this will be the crucial question. I've not had time to refresh my memory of this aspect of the code. This is, I believe, the issue he wishes to discuss with Sir Nigel. And then if we go back to the first page, we then see Mr. Gallagher emailing Mr. Conan and Ms. Sedat in the Blood Policy team on the 31st of March 2005, just to alert you that we've now had to give in to a meeting with Lord Jenkins, set for Wednesday the 13th of April to 9:45. Could you please provide briefing for Sir Nigel? And we will need one person to attend as well, please. I would be grateful if this could include some briefing from Linda or team on records management / filing in the department, as Lord Jenkins believes that we do not seem to have kept proper records from the period in question. I'm not sure about the denied access issue. He hasn't asked to see papers, though I suppose that may be one of the outcomes of the meeting. So those exchanges explain why it is you then had a meeting with Lord Jenkin on the 13th of April 2005.
Yeah.
And then we see there the request for background briefing. The background briefing that you received from Mr. Conan is at WITN 3996010. It's dated the 11th of April 2005, and we can see it's directly addressed to you, Sir Nigel Crisp, as you then were, meeting with Lord Jenkin of Roding, Wednesday 13th of April 2005. Background to Lord Jenkin's request for a meeting: Lord Jenkin has asked to meet with you to discuss his access to all papers which relate to issues on the treatment of haemophilia patients and blood safety, which he would have had access to when he was the Secretary of State for Health and Social Security between 1979 to 1981. Paragraph 2 then refers to the exchanges of correspondence that, and the letter that had been received from Mr. X. And then paragraph 3 says, PSL, that's Lord Warner, has written twice to Lord Jenkin in response to comments made by Mr. X. However, Lord Jenkin appears to be under the impression that we're withholding documents from him. He has also commented on the issue of the department's filing and document management system. There's then a reference to a previous request from Lord Jenkin in 1999. I don't think we need to spend any time on that. And then line to take. Many key papers from the 1970s and 1980s have been destroyed. During the HIV litigation in 1990, many papers from that period were recalled. We understand that papers were not adequately archived and were unfortunately destroyed in the early 1990s. Obviously, we'll come back to that issue, but if we just continue with the document, over the page, we've been in touch with Departmental Records Office to check which files related to the treatment of haemophilia patients and blood safety are still in existence from the period between 1979 to 1981. We've obtained a list of some files from this period. However, at first glance, it is not clear about the extent to which these files will hold papers that Lord Jenkin will have handled. It would require significant staffing resource to go through these files, excuse me, to identify official papers that Lord Jenkin handled at the time. We've not sought to deny Lord Jenkin access to any official papers. And then the next bullet point says, we're aware of the civil service guidance on access to official papers by former ministers. If Lord Jenkin is able to be more specific about the subject matter or documentation that he would like to see, then we can undertake a search for specific papers. Lord Jenkin may be aware that in 2002, ministers commissioned a review of internal papers to clarify the facts surrounding the drive for UK self-sufficiency in blood products in the 1970s and 1980s. We'll let Lord Jenkin know when work is completed on this. There's been a long delay in completing the report, and there's reference to a short note being attached to Annex A on this. I'll come back to that later, Lord Crisp. And then paragraph 5, background briefing is attached on the issue of contaminated blood products and the record management system in DH, including access to official papers by former ministers. Now, it's clear if we go back to the first page and before we look at the rest of this document, that you were being told that many papers from the 70s and 80s have been destroyed. And the only explanation that this document appears to provide for that is an explanation tied to the HIV litigation in 1990. Do you have any recollection of what your reaction was on learning this, presumably for the first time?
No, I don't have any recollection. Or, I can imagine what I might have done, but I don't have any recollection.
Is it something you think that is likely to have troubled you to learn this?
Yes, I'm sure it would have done, yeah.
Did you, if you can remember, did you ask any further questions about how this had happened, or do you think you would have asked further questions about how this happened?
I think that's unlikely. If you look at the dates on this was sent 2 days before the meeting, and I would probably have read it the evening before the meeting, in reality. I mean, every evening I got a box of papers, some of which referred to the following day, but others referred to everything else. So it would have been in amongst a lot of other briefings. So I suspect I didn't have time, because my meeting with Lord Jenkin anyway was first thing in the morning, I think, wasn't it? Or 9 o'clock.
9:45, I think it's going to be.
Yeah.
If we just go on to the rest of this document, page 3. I'm not going to read through it in its entirety. There are a number of claims about the past set out in paragraphs 1 through to 5.
Yep.
The accuracy of some of which, for example, what's said about non-A, non-B hepatitis, we've explored in some detail in earlier inquiry hearings.
Yep.
We've then got line to take on public inquiry. Now, I'll be coming back to the question of public inquiry, but as we have this document open, I'll just read what it says there. We are aware that some people would like the government to set up a public inquiry into this issue. While there's great sympathy for those infected with hepatitis C, and the government has considered the call for a public inquiry very carefully, this has been rejected. In the 70s, non-A, non-B hepatitis infection was generally thought to be a relatively benign condition. Hepatitis C was only identified following major advances in molecular biological techniques. The virus was not fully characterised until 1989. There's then a heading self-sufficiency. If we go over the page, there's reference to the self-sufficiency review in paragraph 7 that was being carried out. Again, I'll come back to that. And then on the issue of record keeping, there's a heading Departmental Obligations for Record Keeping. Paragraph 8 refers to the Public Records Act, and then paragraph 9 says there have been many changes in record-keeping practices since Lord Jenkin was Secretary of State. And then there's a number of bullet points. The organisation of departmental record-keeping was decentralised in the early 1980s. The number of documents and copies of documents being created in the department grew dramatically as the use of photocopiers became widespread. And then this, the NHS executives moved to Quarry House in 92-3 led to a temporary relaxation of the rules for decision-making on the retention of files. Now, just pausing there, Lord Crisp, I understand, of course, this is a number of years before you moved to the Department of Health. But do you have any understanding of why a move by the NHS executive to Quarry House would lead to a temporary relaxation of rules for decision-making on file retention?
No, I don't. Other than the fact that certain civil servants moved from London to Leeds, and therefore perhaps that would have a knock-on effect, but I don't have any understanding.
Do you think it's something that you would have asked about at the time?
No. I think if I look at these documents that you're showing me, or this document that you're showing me, the bit I might have asked about, but I don't think I did, was the one about why the records were destroyed. This other stuff, which was more historical, this bit's more historical, but the other lines to take around the scientific aspects, if you like, the technical aspects, I think it would be unlikely that I would have challenged.
There's then reference to training and awareness, a programme in 93-94, and then paragraph 10 says, but the principles of good record keeping and the advice given to staff have been fairly consistent In particular, the policies and procedures for the management, review and disposal of files and documents are designed to meet the department's own administrative needs and the Public Records Act. And then, if we go down to the last two paragraphs on this page, paragraph 12 says staff are also encouraged not to retain information any longer than needed to support departmental business. In giving staff this guidance, we're following best practice advice published by the National Archives. In particular, the advice has always been that copies of documents held as background to policy thinking or for reference are unlikely to be needed long-term, either to support departmental business or to be preserved in the National Archives. At the top of the next page, guidance has been to dispose of such documents when they're no longer required for business use. Just if we go back to the bottom of the previous page, please, Lawrence. Do you have any reflection on what's said in paragraphs 12 and 13? Paragraph 12, although quite right to observe that it's said to be following best practice advice published by the National Archives, that encouragement not to retain information any longer than needed to support departmental business might give something of a mixed message potentially to staff.
Yes. You showed us earlier the record, the manual for record keeping, which, as I commented at the time, was very much a catch-all and could be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and was a sort of, if you followed that to the letter, you'd keep more than you needed to. What you're saying here is that this seems to be indicating that you might keep less than you're needed to.
Yes.
I can see that there is a difference perhaps in that, yeah.
And do you have any observations, really now, drawing on all your experience, on the advice in paragraph 13? Documents held as background to policy thinking or for reference unlikely to be needed long term?
Well, I think there are two sorts of background papers. There's one which would be from external experts who, you ought to read this paper or whatever, because you can imagine the amount of advice that the Department of Health gets on any issues from any number of different people, some of which they would have rejected. So you can imagine there's quite a lot of stuff there that actually you wouldn't want to pay attention to. But I think there are other things that are background to policy thinking, and I imagine you're referring to minutes of advisory committees and such like, that I would think it was sensible to keep if they were official minutes of an official advisor to the Department of Health. Then you'd expect them to be kept, which I think is an essential point here. But there's lots of other paper. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate the sheer volume of paper and advice that the Department of Health gets on any given day.
If we go to the next page, I'm not going to read through this, but for the benefit of those listening and following and indeed reading the transcript in due course, there's a section there on access by former ministers to official papers.
Yeah.
And then if we just go over the page, what follows are copies of the correspondence we've already looked at.
Yep.
We don't need to go through them again, but these were appended to Mr. Conan's note to you, and so it's fair to assume that at this point in time, the background correspondence which had led up to the meeting was being brought to your attention.
Yeah.
So that's the material that you had prior to the meeting with Lord Jenkin.
Yeah.
If we go now to WITN 3996011, so this is a minute from Sean Gallagher to Ms. Sedat and others, dated the 13th of April 2005. So it's in the evening of the meeting. And we can see it says, Zabida, many thanks for this briefing and for attending the meeting with Lord Jenkin this morning. This is a brief note of what was agreed.
Yeah.
Lord Jenkin said he would like to come into the department to go through the papers that he would have seen while Secretary of State. He recognised that not all the papers would still exist and that it would take some time and effort to identify the relevant files and find the appropriate papers. Nigel said that we should write to Lord Jenkin next week, setting out a timescale for this to happen and how his access to the papers would be facilitated. And then there's a further discussion in relation to that. Bottom of the page, Nigel asked me to mention to Linda Percival the need to ensure that when people such as former Secretaries of State write in, they should receive an appropriate level of attention. On this occasion, I think that the first letter sent was not actually a bad one, though it did not address Lord Jenkin's main point, could he get access to the files. The second letter, by mistakenly including the background note you sent with the draft, gave away the fact that the first letter had been drafted using standard lines, and it was this that offended Lord Jenkin. Finally, Lord Jenkin mentioned an all-party parliamentary group report on hepatitis C that had recently been published. Nigel said that he would like to see a copy. Now, that appears to be the only written record that either the inquiry or those assisting you, Lord Crisp, have found of the meeting. Would you have expected there to be a note, a formal note kept of this meeting or not?
No.
And why is that?
I would expect there to be a brief note setting out what was covered and what actions were taken, and the most important things were the actions.
And we see the actions essentially being set out in this email
So
from
that
Mr Gallagher.
would be, I wouldn't have seen this at the time, but it seems to me that it would be what I would expect to see.
This, I think, doesn't purport to be a narrative of exactly what was said by you or by Lord Jenkin, and you've not seen any other record of.
It's not a narrative. It's the topics that were discussed, and it's the action points.
Now, there was then a follow-up of communications from the department to Lord Jenkin, enabling him to see a number of documents. I think we've a draft letter from Mr Gallagher to Lord Jenkin. I don't think we need to look at that. But we can pick matters up next in October 2005 at WITN 3996013. This is Ms Sedat to Lord Jenkin, 6th of October, and she says, as requested, I'm enclosing the documents you requested following your review of files on blood safety and the issue of haemophilia patients infected with hepatitis C. These papers have been redacted in accordance with guidance under the Freedom of Information Act. So I think we can infer from that Lord Jenkin had been in and inspected some of the files being made available to him.
And that the actions we agreed had been taken.
And then, following your conversation with William Conan last week, you'll be aware that Professor Zuckerman has a number of concerns about the release of papers which refer to his research. This includes concerns about his personal safety. As agreed, we're sending you these papers, and we're very grateful to you for agreeing not to disclose these documents. So the material that was sent to Lord Jenkin, is this right? Some was material which it was understood he might then provide to campaigners or to Mr X or to other parliamentarians, some who he was being asked not to provide.
Yeah.
And then if we go to WITN 3996014, this is a further letter. This is now from Mr Conan in the Blood Policy team to Lord Jenkin, 19th of October 2005. Further to your conversation with Zabida this morning, I attached 2 sets of papers which have been clearly marked. The set of papers for you include research documents from Professor Zuckerman. We're resending all the documents for ease. I understand that you have concerns about the fact that there were limited files available to you. As you know, we requested all files relating to your period in office dealing with haemophilia patients who were infected with contaminated blood products. A number of files from the 1970s and 1980s have in fact been destroyed, but we have made available to you all those which are currently held. I trust you will find the enclosed papers helpful. So again, it would appear from this that Lord Jenkin has expressed a degree of concern about those being given access to what remains, a degree of concern about the extent of the files that remain. Now, just then following through the correspondence, we can see Lord Jenkin then writing back to Mr Conan at WITN 3996015. This is the 25th of October 2005, so it's a few months after the meeting on the 13th of April, but obviously much closer in time to events than we are now. Lord Jenkin is responding to the letter enclosing the two sets of papers, one for him, one he could send on to Mr. X. And then the next paragraph deals with Lord Jenkin's understanding of what he can pass on and what he can't. I don't think we need to read through that. And then this, which refers to the meeting that you had with Lord Jenkin. With regard to the missing files, Sir Nigel warned me when I saw him earlier in the year that a number of files dealing with contaminated blood had been destroyed after the settlement of all the HIV claims. While this may in fact represent what happened, I find it difficult to believe that this was an appropriate cull. I intend to make a further appointment to see Sir Nigel with a view to seeking an explanation of why this happened. The department must have known that there were many more outstanding cases of people who claimed to have been infected by contaminated blood, and indeed many of the present generation of haemophiliacs fall into this category. However, that's not a matter for you, and I will pursue it with Sir Nigel. And then he expresses gratitude for the help that Ms. Sedat had provided. So, two matters arising out of that paragraph, Lord Crisp. The first is, do you have any reason to doubt the accuracy of what Lord Jenkin there says about the discussions that you had, and when he says that you told him a number of files had been destroyed after the settlement of the HIV claims?
Well, I'm sure, as I can be, that I would have used the line to take. And the line to take did indeed say that a number of files dealing with contaminated blood had been destroyed in that period. This goes slightly further, suggesting that, and you're no doubt going to go on to this, that was in some sense a deliberate cull.
Yes. Lord Jenkin's concern, it would appear from this letter, is to understand why that's happened, because he is concerned that it was not an appropriate action, and that's why he wants a further meeting with you to try and get a better understanding of why that had happened.
Yeah. I mean, the line to take, may we put up the line to take that I believe I would have followed? Absolutely.
If we go back to WITN 3996010, please. And the line to take is at the bottom of the page.
Yeah. So, and I know we're going to talk about this further, and that actually this isn't a totally accurate story, and indeed there are two sets of papers here, which of course complicates matters. And of course, the ones that were not adequately archived, most of them were subsequently found, as we know. But having said all of that, if I stuck to that line, which is what I'm pretty confident I would have done, for a whole series of reasons, but I'll come. Would you like me to say the reasons why I think I did?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I think there are three. I mean, the first is I didn't have any other knowledge about this. So why would I do anything other than stick to the line that people were giving me? You're quite right that I could have questioned it, but I don't think I did. So that's the first point. I think the second point was what in subsequent correspondence, but not in that correspondence, where he goes on to say that, well, I mean, there are two bits, aren't there? There's one where he goes on to say that I said, I set some reason for why they were destroyed. And then in a subsequent one, in his evidence to Lord Archer's inquiry, I see he said, I surmised from that he meant this, referring to me. So I can see that he extrapolated some of what I would have said. But I think the second reason I wouldn't have said that is it wasn't true. Because as I just said, we actually discovered, didn't we, that in the 2007 report, that most of these papers had been retained had been taken out of the registered system, had been retained in the branch and were in some cupboards somewhere and had not been returned to the registered system. And the third reason, I think why I'm pretty confident I stuck to this, is that or indeed very confident, is that my officials would have raised it if I hadn't. They'd have raised it with me, and if I'd said something that was totally wrong, as Lord Jenkins implies in his later letters, then I've no doubt I would have written to Lord Jenkins to apologise and to correct the record. So I think there are a whole series of reasons why I really do think I stuck to that.
We'll come back to the correspondence and the evidence to Lord Archer, because I'm going to take it chronologically. Just in relation to the 2007 report that you referred to, that of course is after your time in office.
Indeed,
so
yeah.
You wouldn't have known, and your officials wouldn't have known, that some of the documents at least were going to be found.
No.
At this point in time.
My point is that what he alleges that I said, or what he says that I said, let me not say alleges he said, didn't happen to be true, is really the point that I'm making. So I wouldn't have any evidence for saying it.
If we just go back to the letter from Lord Jenkins to Mr Conan at WITN 3996.015. Again, just to remind ourselves before we look at the following correspondence, on any view, Lord Jenkins has taken from this, correctly I think if your evidence a moment ago is right, that there's a link between the destruction of the files and the settlement of the HIV claims.
I don't for a moment doubt that Lord Jenkins believed what he said. I don't.
And that's consistent with the line to take, isn't it? Because the line to take talks about...
Well, the timing is consistent, yes. The timing was consistent. But this gives the sense of intention.
Yes, and that's what Lord Jenkins wants to talk to you further about.
Yeah.
If we then go to WITN 3996.016, we'll see that Lord Jenkins wrote to you on the same date as his letter to Mr Conan, so 25th of October 2005. Says this: it's some months since you and I met to discuss my request to examine certain files which related to my period as Secretary of State for Health. And then he refers to having now been sent copies of a number of the papers. And then the next paragraph says this: however, as you indicated at the outset, all the files which would have borne upon the subject of contaminated blood products no longer exist. I have to say that I find this extremely surprising, given that the government must have known that there were many further cases of people suffering from contaminated blood, notably haemophiliacs, some of whom have contracted various forms of hepatitis. I would very much like to come and discuss this with you and to explore why it was thought right to destroy these files. They represent by any standards a most unhappy chapter in the department's history, and I would be very distressed indeed if this was felt to be an adequate reason for their destruction. Perhaps your private secretary would be kind enough to telephone me with a view to making an appointment. If we just go back up, please, Lawrence. So this is a direct request to you for him to be given more information about how these files came to be destroyed. That's the only reasonable understanding of this letter.
I think it is. I think there's an unfortunate tendency throughout a lot of these papers for people to say all the files when they actually mean a group of files. This occurs right the way through all these papers that people are saying that all the files related to something were destroyed. But certainly what he's asking for is he wants another meeting to discuss why they were destroyed.
Now, at this point in the chronology of events, it would appear from the documents we've looked at that the only information that you'd been given in writing, at least, about documents being destroyed related to documents from the 70s and 80s destroyed in the aftermath of the HIV litigation.
I believe so. Yeah. I believe that was the case.
And you'd not at that point in time, at this point in time here, been told that there were documents that had been destroyed in the 1990s relating to the work of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood.
That were contained in that earlier audit report.
Yes. And if we look at WITN 3996017, this is an exchange of emails between Anita James and Zabida Sedat. I don't think we need to go through them in any detail, not least because both are giving evidence in the course of this week. But they flag up the existence of the internal audit report, and we can see an email at the top of the page, Ms. Sedat requesting a copy of that and referring in the second paragraph of her email to the issue in relation to Lord Jenkin and absence of files. For the sake of completeness, the audit report, we've looked at it elsewhere and we'll no doubt look at it with witnesses in the course of this week, but it's at WITN 3996018. And if we just go to the second page, we see it's a report from April 2000.
Yeah.
And it's looking at the destruction of a series of files, the GEB, in the GEB series, and why they had been destroyed. If we can then turn to the advice you received following Lord Jenkins' letter to you requesting a meeting, it's at WITN 3996019. It's dated the 29th of November 2005, and it's from Ms. Sedat to you.
Yeah.
It says, Lord Jenkins asked to meet with you again to discuss the issue of record management in the Department of Health and why papers from the 1970s and 80s on the issue of haemophilia patients infected with hepatitis C have been destroyed. A draft letter declining his request to meet is attached to Annex A. Then there is the heading background. There's reference in paragraph 2 to your meeting in April with Lord Jenkin. And then in paragraph 3, it refers to the steps that were taken following the meeting. And then under the heading destruction of papers, paragraph 4, it says this: at your meeting with Lord Jenkin and his 2 visits to the department to inspect the files, we made clear that many key papers from the 1970s and 1980s have been destroyed. These events took place a long time ago. However, our understanding is that during the HIV litigation in the 1990s, many papers from that period were recalled. We understand that papers were not adequately archived and were unfortunately destroyed in the early 1990s. In addition, we have established that many other important documents, mostly papers and minutes of the Advisory Committee on Virological Safety of Blood, were destroyed in the 1990s. This should not have happened. During the discovery exercise for the hepatitis C litigation in 2000, it emerged that many files were missing. A low-key internal investigation was undertaken by colleagues in internal audit to establish why files were destroyed. We've managed to obtain the report by internal audit. This concludes, and then there's an extract, the decision to mark the files for destruction was taken at a time of major organisational change in the department, i.e. the implementation of the functions and manpower review, which resulted in 2 experienced members of staff leaving the relevant section. We believe that the upheavals of the FMR process probably resulted in either a delegation of responsibilities without proper instruction or an assumption of responsibility without proper authorisation. Either occurrence, likely given the organisational context, is the most probable explanation for the decision to mark the files for destruction and the short destruction dates assigned. And then there's a reference to some recommendations by the internal audit report about the importance of record keeping. And then the advice recommendation, we advise that you decline to meet with Lord Jenkin. He was informed from the outset from the 1970s, from the outset the papers from the 1970s and 1980s were missing, and the draft letter attached explains in detail our understanding of why papers were destroyed. And then if we go to the next page, we've got the draft letter that's being referred to.
Could I
Yes.
just take you back to the first page,
Of
actually,
course.
just for one moment, because it does, it is, I think, relevant. She says here, at my meeting with Lord Jenkins, we made clear that many papers have been destroyed. If in some way I had said these were destroyed because of what he later said in a subsequent thing about them being destroyed because of they weren't needed anymore, you know, as if it was a deliberate departmental policy decision. I think she would have been saying to me, you will recall that you said that at this point.
It is right to know Ms Cedar was present at the meeting according to the contemporaneous records.
Yeah. But what she's put there, of course, is the line to take that I think was the one that I followed at the meeting.
Did you think that what's said in that last sentence of the paragraph that's on the screen was a satisfactory or adequate explanation? Or indeed that it excludes the possibility that there might have been a deliberate decision?
Oh, I can see how a misunderstanding can come from it, if that's what you're getting at. And I also think that Lord Jenkins is perfectly reasonable to come back, having thought about it and no doubt discussed it with other people, and to say why were they destroyed. And I think the subsequent letter you're about to take us on to gives our explanation as best as we could of why they were destroyed.
If we go to page 3, this is the draft letter, which Ms Cedar, in her minutes use, says explains in detail our understanding about why papers were destroyed. If we look in the second paragraph, it says, when we met in April, I explained that certain papers dating back to the 70s and 80s have been destroyed. I appreciate that you would like to discuss this further. However, I thought it would be helpful to write to you about this issue instead. Naturally, I'm concerned that important files from this period no longer exist. Although these events took place a long time ago, my officials have undertaken to explore why important documents were destroyed. As previously mentioned, it is our understanding that during the HIV litigation in the 1990s, many papers from that period were recalled for the purpose of the litigation. We understand that papers were not adequately archived and were subsequently destroyed in error in the early 1990s. Now, I just want to pause there because what it then goes on to talk about is the other set of papers.
Yeah.
But what we've got there is an assertion now that it was destruction in error in the early 1990s. Mm-hmm. If we go back to the original line to take you were given before your meeting, WITN 3996010, bottom of the page, we've got the same explanation to some extent, the recall of the papers during the HIV litigation, an issue about archiving, and then the phrases there were unfortunately destroyed in the early 1990s. Now, what this line to take doesn't say one way or another whether it's erroneous or a deliberate decision.
It leaves it open, I agree, and the second one
does.
Seeks to make it clear.
Yes. So if we go back to the second one, WITN 3996019, page 3. Yeah. To your knowledge, was any further inquiry or investigation undertaken that allowed the statement to be made that this document destruction was in error?
I don't know. Simply don't know.
We then see the next paragraph deals with the second set of documents, so the files marked for destruction in the 1990s, reference to the internal review, and then Ms Cedak's draft letter says this: I understand that a decision most probably made by an inexperienced member of staff was responsible for the destruction of the number of files. The decision to mark the files for destruction was not a deliberate attempt to destroy documentation. It's very unfortunate that the staff member at the time was not fully aware of the significance of the files and the possibility of future litigation. I'm going to come back to that description in due course, Lord Crisp. I'll just read it for now. And then there's an apology in the next paragraph. Very sorry the department no longer holds many papers going back to the 1970s and 1980s. And then the next paragraph talks about all departmental staff being informed about principles of good record keeping, reference to the Public Records Act, and so on. And we can see that's the draft that Ms Cedak's note says explains in detail our understanding about why papers were destroyed. And the letter that you sent is essentially in that form. It's at it's the same page, the same document, page 7, please. So you sent it on the 1st of December to Lord Jenkin, and I think it's identical. I can double check. I think it's identical in terms of its text to the draft, but if we go over the page, I assume that's your handwriting at the bottom,
indeed, yeah.
Lord Crispy, saying, I'm very sorry that this has happened. So that was your addition to the letter.
Yeah.
Now, again, just sticking with the chronological events before I ask you some more general questions about this. Lord Jenkin... Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
May I just ask one question? The words were added to the earlier draft, the words in error. The instruction was in error. That rather begs the question what the error was. Did you ever ask?
No. I don't think I did. Straightforwardly.
Because it's hardly, perhaps, a reason for the destruction of something to say, well, it was an error, without knowing quite what the error was.
Well, I agree. Looking at this, one could see that there could be a bigger, a clearer explanation to describe how that happened. And I think later on we do get, well, actually the report in 2007 does produce one, but at this stage we didn't know the information.
Yes, thank you.
So your letter of the 1st of December triggered a response from Lord Jenkin on the 14th of December at WITN 3996020. Where Lord Jenkin says this, having first of all thanked you for your letter. As you may imagine, this has caused a considerable stir both among some of my colleagues in the House and among the haemophiliac community in the country. The immediate point that occurs to me is that your 4th paragraph entirely contradicts the explanation you gave to me orally when we met in your office on Wednesday the 13th of April. You then gave me to understand that the destruction of the contaminated blood files was the result of a decision to dispose of them, as following the settlement of the HIV cases, there seemed to be no useful purpose in retaining them in the PRO. I am quite certain that I did not misunderstand you. There was no suggestion whatever in what you said that the destruction of the files was the result of an administrative cock-up. Despite what you say that this did not represent a deliberate attempt to destroy documentation, I am sure that you will recognise that this latest explanation will do nothing to dispel the widely held view among haemophiliacs and others that this was, in fact, the true explanation. Lord Jenkin's letter then goes on to ask about a review that Ms Sediat had spoken to him about. That, I think, is a reference, although it's described as the status and progress on the review of the hepatitis C cases, I think it may be a reference to the self-sufficiency review that had been commissioned by, I think, Yvette Cooper. And then he says at the bottom of the page, I would now ask when this report can be expected. And again, we'll come back to that issue. Over the page, he says, all this seems to me to be a very serious case of maladministration by the Department of Health, and I'm consulting urgently with colleagues as to whether the matter should be referred to Miss Anne Abrahams, the Parliamentary Ombudsman for the Health Service. So if we just go back to the first page, this is Lord Jenkin very clearly setting out his belief as to what you had said to him in the meeting on the 13th of April. So you'd have been in no doubt on receiving this letter what it was Lord Jenkin thought you'd said to him. Is that fair?
Yes, yeah, indeed, yeah.
Now, if we just pick matters up then, next, at WITN 3996021, these are some documents and a background note relating to or anticipating a parliamentary question. If we go to page 5,
right,
we can see there's a written question from Lord Morris, which was I think clearly relates in part at least to the request from Lord Jenkin. It may also have resulted from a request from Lord Owen, but in any event, the question is to ask Her Majesty's Government what inquiries the DH has received from former health ministers to examine files, what replies they've given and what further responses, if any, they've received. And then the suggested reply there refers to Lord Jenkin's correspondence and meeting, and then it says in that second paragraph, the last sentence, we acknowledged early on in Lord Jenkin's inquiries that, and then the phrase many papers, someone's crossed out and is suggesting the use of the phrase a number of papers, but from the 1970s and 1980s have been destroyed in error. So we've got the same phrase in error here being used for the suggested parliamentary reply. And if we go to page 3, this is a background note from, I think, the blood policy team. And again, if we pick it up at paragraph 4, we can see that there's been media interest, including accusing officials of a cover-up. And then paragraph 5 says, Lord Jenkins written again to Sir Nigel Crisp, indicating he'd like a further meeting. Sir Nigel replied on the 1st of December, declining his request for a meeting. However, the response set out fully our understanding of why papers have been destroyed. Now, I think it may be apparent from your answer to the Chair's question, Lord Crisp, but would you accept that the letter referring to in error and the archiving doesn't set out a full explanation? It might be the full extent of the department's understanding, but it doesn't give a complete explanation of how this had happened, does it?
No, it doesn't. Let me just go back to the point about in error, which is clearly an important point. It may be that the revised line to take could have easily been mistaken the first time round and they'd intended to put in error in at that time. And indeed, if they had put in error in at that time, it would have made life easier, wouldn't it, in terms of what Lord Jenkin obviously took away from it, that it was a deliberate destruction of files. But yes, I mean, I don't think any of this is good. You know? I mean, if that's really the nub of your question, we've provided an explanation to Lord Jenkin, but it doesn't tell you why those files were destroyed, and of course they weren't destroyed, which complicates the story even further. They were just misfiled, or they were not returned to the registry, the files we were referring to. So it's not a good story.
Can I then come to a further minute from Masida to you in February 2006, WITN 3996022. This, I think, is written in response to that further letter from Lord Jenkin on the 14th of December 2005, because paragraph 1 says, Lord Jenkin's written again about the issue of record management and why papers on the issue of haemophilia patients infected with hepatitis C have been destroyed. Lord Jenkin has also asked when the report on self-sufficiency in blood products in England and Wales will be published.
Yeah.
And then a number of matters set out by way of background. Interesting, I note paragraph 3 uses again the language of that first line to take and doesn't use the term in error. It just says were unfortunately destroyed in the early 1990s. Paragraph 4 then refers to the discovery of the ACVSB files having been destroyed. Paragraph 5, last sentence, refers to accusations that the department's deliberately destroyed documents. Then there's reference to the self-sufficiency report. Now, if we then go, there's a draft letter for you to send to Lord Jenkin on page 3. But the actual letter is page 4. Again, I think it's probably in the same format, but we'll look at the actual letter in any event. So 6th of February 2006, thank you for your letter of the 14th of December. I'm sorry for the delay in responding to you. When we met, I explained that certain papers dating back to the 1970s and 1980s have been destroyed following the HIV litigation. Following your inquiries, officials established that a number of other files were also marked for destruction. As I said in my previous reply, I'm very sorry that many papers have been destroyed. And then the next paragraph deals with the publication of the review of papers on self-sufficiency in blood products. Now, I just want to put your letter up side by side with the letter that you're responding to. So, Lawrence, could we have also on screen the first page of WITN 3996020? So in that letter on the left-hand side of the screen, Lord Jenkins' letter to you, he's saying to you there, as you've agreed, Lord Crisp, in terms that you told him there was a positive decision to dispose of the documents following the HIV settlement, no administrative cock-up. And he's saying there's an inconsistency between what you told him in the meeting and what the subsequent correspondence has said. Now, your letter doesn't deal with that at all, Lord Crisp. It doesn't say, for example, Lord Jenkins, you've misunderstood, or I didn't say that in our meeting. Why?
I have no idea, frankly, why it didn't. I should say that on the 6th of February 2006, I was probably in the process of negotiating my leaving from the department, and therefore this looks very much, doesn't it, like a sort of final letter that I was trying to close something down, or my officials were trying to close something down, rather than move it on. So it's, in that sense, it doesn't reply to that, no.
And the letter that you sent, I think it is in identical format to the draft. So your officials also haven't picked up.
My officials?
Your officials who drafted this letter for you, and we understand from other evidence, not least from ministers, that both ministers and senior civil servants often don't draft their own correspondence. They will have drafts prepared for them. So we understand that process. Yeah. And we can see from the papers this was drafted for you, I think, by the blood policy team. But they haven't, notwithstanding Ms Sedat's presence at the meeting, said, oh no, Lord Jenkins, you've got it wrong. I'm sorry, that's not what Sir Nigel said. Now, one inference that one could be drawn from that is that it's because Lord Jenkins accurately recorded what you said in the meeting.
It is indeed. But as I say earlier, I don't remember the meeting, but I would have had no reason to say that. I didn't have any other knowledge, and as it turned out, it wasn't true. And I think they would have told me if I hadn't done it appropriately, if I'd said that. And there's no evidence that anybody did, and I certainly have no recollection of it. So there's a discrepancy. There's a very clear discrepancy. And you're quite right. Had one been thinking about it, one could have gone back and said, actually, I disagree with you, but I can also see why you might not want to go back and disagree with you and continue the correspondence. You know? The way I see it is that obviously he heard something from me that he interpreted in a certain way. And as I said, if you look at his evidence to Lord Archer's inquiry, you will see that he doesn't quite say it as strongly as he does within this, and he talks about surmising what was meant by something. So I think, while it is puzzling, there is clearly some discrepancy in all of this and some misunderstanding. But as I say, I can see absolutely no reason why I could or would have said that, and it would have been out of character for me not to have followed the line to take, particularly in an area where I didn't know the subject area. You know?
We'll look after lunch at Lord Jenkins' evidence to the Archer inquiry, but both so that we can put it in the public domain, so to speak, through this inquiry, but also...
right.
No, obviously it was in the public domain during the inquiry, but so that those listening to your evidence can follow it, but also so that you can make any further observations you want to. But just before we break for lunch, you were advised to decline the request for a further meeting, and it's apparent you accepted that advice because there was no further meeting, and the letter was sent instead. But Well, why not have a further meeting with Lord Jenkin, particularly given that this was an issue which the media had got hold of? These are serious matters, accusations of a cover-up, of deliberate destruction of documents to conceal an unhappy chapter in the department's history.
Well, I think there are probably three things there. One is there was an awful lot of things in the public domain. There were lots of other things going on around this. I think clearly from the perspective of the department, they felt they had offered Lord Jenkin everything that they knew at the time, and that it would have been sensible for us to sort of close the discussion down and to move on from there. There was obviously a different view about what had happened at the meeting. So I imagine there were all those sort of pressures around, but there was a lot of other things going on at that time. And I think that would be why I would accept it. I mean, generally I would be probably more willing to have meetings than my office would want me to be. But I think on this occasion it was clearly, looking at this correspondence, a question of closing it down and moving on, really. But as I say, there's a very simple point here at one level, which is that if I had said something like that, it would have been straightforwardly wrong. I didn't have any other information from any other source. This was not a topic I knew anything about. And as it turned out, the files we described as having been destroyed weren't destroyed. So I agree it's puzzling.
So if we could break for lunch at this point, and then we can pick up the thread at 2 or 2:05.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 2:05. 2:05.